Welcome to the Aerospace Advantage podcast, brought to you by PenFed. I'm your host, Heather Lucky Penney. Here on the Aerospace Advantage, we speak with leaders in the DoD, industry, and other subject matter experts to explore the intersection of strategy, operational concepts, technology, and policy when it comes to air and space power. And just a note for our listeners, the views and comments from the Air Force active duty officers here on the Aerospace Advantage are their own and do not represent or reflect the views of the U.S. Air Force or the Department of Defense. So welcome back for the second episode in our special series exploring key concepts driving the current focus on air and missile defense for the Homeland. We spent last episode explaining why the threat is driving a lot of concern these days. And we see images of air and missile strikes on Ukraine and Israel often, but the U.S. is similarly vulnerable. Given hostility displayed by China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and their proxies, plus their advanced offensive technical means, these are not fanciful threats. We have to take them seriously. Building a competent set of defenses takes time, and that's why we need to act now. Programs like Golden Dome and other forms of air and missile defense, especially across our northern borders, are especially important in this regard. And this isn't a political thing. It's straight up national interest. To better help us understand how we might want to architect these next-generation air and missile defenses, it's really useful to consider the approaches that we adopted the last time our homeland was under this sort of threat, the Cold War. Many of the concepts and overarching paradigms defense innovators pioneered in those decades are now super relevant. We're in a back-to-the-future type of moment. To help us explore this history, I've asked a few members of our team to join us. First and foremost, our Air and Missile Defense Project Lead, Brigadier General Houston Cantwell. Slider, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Lucky. Great to be here.
It's great to have you back. And as we've explained, Slider just finished a report on this very topic. It's called Homeland Sanctuary Lost. You can find it on our website, and we'll also include a link in our show notes as well. And also with us is Lieutenant Colonel Big Bobby Wallis. Now, Big Bobby was an Air Force fellow a few years ago, and once a Michelier, always a Michelier. Bobby is an air battle manager who spent considerable portion of his career studying early air defense command concepts, and they are hugely reliant on the command and control, which is his specialty. So, Big Bobby, great to have you with us.
Hey, thanks for having me again. Always talking about a subject I am deeply passionate about, and that's command and control and all things related to surveillance.
Well, I'll tell you what, Big Bobby, having you here as a fellow really turned all of us into hardcore believers. So we are part of that tribe. And lastly, we've also got Doug Birkey, but not least, from our team. Doug has investigated the history of air battle management, command and control, and homeland defense across a number of different projects. So we're really happy to have him here. Doug, welcome back to the podcast.
No, thanks, guys.
Okay, so Doug, we're going to start with you. Can you help us set the scene? Why did air defense become such a big deal during the early days of the Cold War?
So there's one date that really has to play first and foremost in this equation, and that's 29 August 1949. That's the day that the Soviet Union detonated their first atomic bomb. And from that point forward, nothing was the same for U.S. Homeland Defense. I mean, you think about it, World War II, we watched newsreels of Britain under attack and Europe devastated and things in Asia that were going on. But we never really had to think about it here because we were protected by the oceans, a giant moat that really defended America. But during World War II, there were B-29s that ended up diverting from raids on Japan due to mechanical issues and things like that into the Soviet Union, the very west of the Soviet Union. And the crews are just trying to not go in the drink. And the Soviets impounded the aircraft, and they actually, no kidding, reverse engineered them. And they built exact copies. And those are made by Tupolev, the Tu-4, what we called the Bull. And they built about 847 of them. So you pair a B-29's range with an atomic bomb, and all of a sudden, the U.S. homeland is under existential threat. And it was something that absolutely was a mic drop moment, changing the notion of defense and what it meant to really have to secure the homeland in ways we had never thought about to the founding of the country. And so at that point in time, it's a back to the future moment where, well, what did Britain do when they were under attack? They created a set of sensors with radars and other means of gathering data. They processed that information into actionable command and control inputs, and they piped it to the fighter units and vectored them in on attacks. And that's fundamentally what we worked on creating on steroids over the next several years at the Air Defense Command and NORAD and things like that. But we're going to explore more of that. So I'll wrap it up here for this intro portion, but it's all about the nuclear threat.
Yeah, and the fact that there was the nuclear threat, which we had seen actually end the war in Japan, paired with that range that those reverse engineered bombers, the Tu-4s, were able to provide. And they weren't necessarily coming across the Pacific, they were coming across the poles. And I think that's also a really key point. Now, Big Bobby, Doug outlined kind of the classic kill chain and what we would need to do to respond and protect the homeland, and that we would need to find. So we need to first be able to detect those bombers. We need to be able to fix them and track them, and then target and engage them. That's a classic kill chain. Walk us through the macro components from your battle management perspective, because what we're talking here is a pretty classic model that is enduring. It's not just tied to specific technologies.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, thankfully, during World War II, and when Britain was at first defending itself and then pressing the offensive over into mainland Europe, there were a small group of professionals in the United States that were taking pretty close notes of the radar technology that developed, the communication technology that was needed. And they'd really started thinking critically about homeland defense, especially as that Russian threat started to grow. And as Doug had mentioned, with the detonation of their first nuclear device in the late 1940s. And so the challenge that we had was covering, a huge space. And so I'll walk us through a little bit about that. So in terms of air defense, finding has always been one of the most perennial challenges. There's just so much space to cover. And in the United States, what's that?
Big sky theory, right?
Yeah, big sky, so much space to cover on our east and west coast, as well as our northern border shared with Canada. And Canada had a concern with this as well. And not just the space, but the varying geography of that space. We have mountains all the way up against the coast out west. We have relatively flat coastland or coastal areas in the east. And then going north, it's just a huge, hard to access area. And there's some really interesting histories on the construction of some of those radar sites. But it's always been a challenge to cover the space. And then once you find something in that space, you can actually start to marshal resources towards it, which is where you get into the fixing phase. And so that is its own challenge, and you can redirect sensors to help identify the tracks and determine what those intentions were. And depending on the speed of some of these threats, and starting out with bombers, by the way, the threat continues today with modern missiles, is just figuring out where that threat's going. And when something comes over the poles, that is a huge challenge when it comes to finding out where you're going to point these limited resources that we have to defend. Now, once you've got the finding and the fixing kind of determined, tracking is basically the maintenance of that target on our systems. And that started out early in the chain home system with the Brits literally pushing pucks across a board, and evolved to plotting boards and things of that nature through early rudimentary battle management systems. But that tracking is basically the ability to see where it is and continue to build information on it to refine what its intentions are and get more details, because the details really start to matter at the tracking phase. And then once you get into the targeting phase, this is where we're going to start executing some effect against it. And then there's actually a couple of components that are changing here, or there's actually a couple of other components beyond the targeting, and that's the engaging and assessing, each of which bring their own challenges. But that's kind of the fundamental way that is enduring. And really that challenge and that process hasn't changed even as the technology has evolved around it.
Yeah, it's amazing how the doubting system encapsulated that entire find, fix, track, target, engage, and assess, and how what we've been doing ever since then has been following that broader model. Now, Slider, talk to us about the scale and play for this challenge. Big Bobby talked about the big sky, the challenge of the geography. I mean, whether or not it's the mountains that can provide the geographical shadowing, or just the challenge of the weather that we have to be able to endure, the magnetic variation and so forth. I mean, there's a lot involved with continental defense. So what challenges does that really bring to bear to this problem?
Yeah, Lucky, there were a lot of challenges to overcome. I'd characterize them as extreme. So coming out of World War II, aviation technology was accelerating. Bombers are flying higher, they're flying faster, and the smaller fighter aircraft were having a hard time to keep up. Jets, you saw, were making their debut, but they really weren't widespread until the mid-50s. And most importantly, radar technology was also very new. They could see the high altitude aircraft, But it's important to point out they couldn't see low altitude stuff.
Yeah.
And so you had
That
some
terrain masking.
significant vulnerabilities. And Big Bobby mentioned, and in the mountains, it got 10 times.
Yeah.
10
Over
times
the
worse.
horizon. I mean, lots of problems
Yep.
there.
And so when the radars did see a contact, that's what they saw. It was a blip on the screen. And so, we're used to modern radars where it tells you where the airplane is, how fast it's going, the direction. Back then, you didn't have the computers. So it took a very skilled operator to look at the screen and watch the radar come back every few seconds and figure out, all right, here's the altitude of the plane, here's the speed it's going at, and here's the direction it's heading. And that was something that was all being designed in the 50s. Huge challenges to overcome. And then you talk about command and control systems. These also had to be designed from the ground up. There was no internet. Even commercial telephone was barely reliable.
Yeah.
So communication links had to be designed. They had to be acquired and installed between every node, headquarters, radar sites, air bases. And you knew that time was going to be of the essence. So rapid command and control had to be part of this overall plan. And then you had your interceptor aircraft. They didn't have long-range air-to-air radars.
No.
So they were completely relying on these radar operators that were on the ground, talking to them through the radio and guiding them to where they needed to be.
They actually also had data links back then, and this blows my mind. Link 4 was that early data link from the semi-automatic ground environment, and so they were transmitting the information from the Sage computer through the Link 4 data link to the cockpit. And did you know the F-106 actually allowed the radar operator to hand fly with a little baby joystick the F-106 to the point of intercept where they could actually then see with their little tiny radars? So F-106 could really only see about 10 miles of it when it was first fielded.
Right.
So you had to actually have the radar operator on the ground. And think about the latency that's involved. Think about the imperfections regarding the precision of the data and the radar. This is some really sophisticated stuff. They were very leading edge.
And so before things like data links, you had people talking on the radio. And by the time they're even talking and telling the pilot where to go and what direction to head, that information may be outdated by the time they can get it out. And so a lot of new skills are being developed as we're coming up with this.
Yeah, no, just amazing.
Okay, Heather, you're on deck here with this one. In the Wayback Machine, you wrote a mother of all reports that dealt with Air Defense Command and SAGE and all that. And you guys are tossing around terms, but I want to level set people because this is a really important build to understand the concepts in play and the technology. And so, Houston talked about scale, and we mentioned speed a lot. I mean, I mentioned B-29s, but pretty soon jet bombers come along, then missiles come along. And so you're talking about closure rates that are demanding really precise intercepts. And so you're talking about things like data link to the F-106. Zoom us back, take it up in altitude, describe the various components, if you don't mind, and kind of how it all fits into pieces. Because I know we have defense sectors because of scale and different technologies. There's a lot to it, but it is so important.
Yeah. So, Doug, what you mentioned is crucial, right? So we've got bombers that we anticipated would come over the pole because that was the shortest way for Russia, for the Soviet Union to be able to touch the U.S. homeland, was to come over that North Pole. So we're dealing with extreme environments. It's super cold, very, very harsh weather, but we've got to be able to find them early again because there's a lot of big sky out there, but the closer we can get to the pole, the smaller that chunk of sky is, if you just imagine how that geography works. So way up north, we had the DEW line, the distant early warning line of radars. And there, again, dudes out there maintaining the radars, helping to operate the radars and ensuring that their communication links that are in the ground are able to stay healthy and get that information further back and pass that information off to the Canadian line, which, as you can imagine, is in Canada. And so, again, we're replicating this as we're trying to have a positive pass-off so we maintain constant contact and custody of the target when it goes from the DEW line to the Canadian line and then again to Pine Tree, which is essentially at the very top of the U.S. border. And so as we're doing this, it matters because maintaining that target custody allows us to be able to identify, do that fixing, determine intent, where are they going to go, so we can begin to anticipate what alert fighters we need to launch because we can anticipate where we think those bombers are going. So the DEW line, the Canadian line, the Pine Tree line, they were all feeding their sensor information to defense sectors. These sectors got all the information across the line, partly because they didn't know immediately where that bomber was going to go, but also because it provided them resilience in case one of them did get bombed or did end up having a power outage. So you end up having some resilience, and each sector had the ability to reach into the next sector's fighter bases to do those air defense launches. And then we talked about the air defense interceptors, 101s, 102s, F-106s, for the time advanced and then supersonic aircraft, because speed is in distance is time, right? So the faster the aircraft is, the sooner it can get to that bomber and make that intercept, and the further away you can splash that bomber to prevent them from being able to reach their target inside the homeland. And as Slider was saying, this was very challenging. As Bobby was saying, this was very challenging from being able to understand where that bomber was, because there's a lot of error. You've got a lot of uncertainty within the volume of space of where that target might potentially be. And so you've got to be able to get there as soon as possible. The slower the targets were going, back when they were the TU-4s, that was easier to be able to manage. But when they began to become supersonic, that was far more deadly. Then when you start talking about cruise missiles and then intercontinental ballistic missiles, which come later on, it complicates the problem set.
No, that's really helpful. I appreciate that. And again, when we're talking about this and we keep saying northern tier, it's because we look at the map wrong normally.
Yeah.
When we look at this west to east and the standard projection, you got to look at it top down. Those are the shortest routes. And that's why this northern tier thing is such a big deal. And there's another piece of scale that, as you're talking about, I just think it's important to emphasize for people. You know, we in the 50s, we'd like to talk about strategic air command, and you hear about tactical air command. Air defense command was just as big. There were dozens and dozens of squadrons of fighter units and the battle managers and all that. I mean, this was massive commitment of resources. And it was so important that we had our backs against the wall in several parts of the Korean conflict. And we refused to cut Air Defense Command fighters loose because we took this deadly seriously. And so it just cannot be overemphasized, the level of seriousness, the commitment of resources here. And it was absolutely essential.
Doug, can I jump in there for a minute? Yeah. I mean, it was not uncommon for guys to live their entire career within Air Defense Command. It was the skill sets that they developed were highly specialized. There was a level of precision, just like Strategic Air Command, that, I mean, if you didn't get it right, it was a goner, because they knew that the threat was existential. And so, as you mentioned, this Air Defense Command ADC was just as big as SAC or TAC, and was, if not as important, maybe even more important.
Yeah, and it's a forgotten command, which I feel bad about. They shouldn't be. They really worked hard, and what they innovated was amazing. So, Bobby, I want to cut to you here really fast, and I'll give the stick back to Heather for emceeing this thing. But, you know, you're an AWACS guy, JSTARS guy with your battle management experience, and the roots of those airborne battle management sensor tools really go back to this era, and it's kind of a forgotten thing. We think about those fixed radar lines up in the north, but there was another problem set, and that was, how do we look at our coastal defense as well? And guess what? It's a little tricky to put fixed radars out in the ocean. And so can you describe to us how those came to being as well? Because if there's anything that's been lasting in many regards, it's these mobile sensor / command and control platforms that are so important. And I mean, heck, we saw the fight over the E-7 this summer, and whether we continue that, this is a pretty big deal. And if you could explain those routes, I think it'd be helpful for the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, the northern tier had its huge challenges with the DEW line, the Canadian line, the Pine Tree line, and everything, mostly because a lot of the places they put those radars were austere, no roads. Coastlines present a different challenge with the curvature of the earth and being able to detect low-level aircraft. And so, and there were particularly places around our major populated areas like New York City, Boston, Washington, D.C., where the ability to get warning in enough time if an aircraft were to come via that route was pretty slim. With SAGE being a pretty integrated system, I mean, we're not, I wouldn't say we're doing it a disservice, not talking about how huge it was, but I mean, SAGE was a massive undertaking that was very integrated. to lots of different radars. Well, they still couldn't plug that gap on the coast. And so they started looking at a couple of different solutions. And it started with some fixed sites that basically looked like overgrown oil rigs. They were called the Texas Towers. And they were built out on some areas of the ocean that are traditionally terrible weather. And it was not uncommon for some of these fixed sites to just disappear. Like they would bring a rotational crew out to the coordinates and that site would no longer be there with no sign of it. And it was a big problem to build enough of them as well with the construction requirements for deep ocean, turbulent weather. I mean, these are things that even oil companies haven't cracked the code on necessarily.
Well, and they had picket ships, and even the picket ships really couldn't fill this gap either.
Yeah, and I was just getting ready to get over to the picket ships now, and so the Navy really didn't want to do the picket ship because it wasn't directly tied to fleet operations, and so these ships that had rudimentary data links and radars on them were basically on endless type patrols, not directly tied with the fleet or what the Navy viewed as their traditional power projection. And so the Air Force was looking at their solutions. And around the same point in time, you had aircraft, basically a convergence of two different technologies. You had aircraft that were getting large enough and efficient enough to generate enough electrical power to run at the same time radar sets that were getting smaller. And that's where you see the EC-121 come along. So it was a variation off of a commercial airliner, the Connie, designed by Howard Hughes and was put into service. And then around 1953, the U.S. Air Force had bought a collection of these things and started outfit with two different radars on them, an azimuth scanning radar on the bottom, the traditional dome-looking thing, and a shark fin elevation finding radar at the top. And they were to go out off the coasts far enough to detect aircraft with enough time and warning to scramble fighters to intercept. I'd like to emphasize, though, that this was not exactly pleasant duty. So we had bases on either coast, McClellan Air Force Base in California and Otis Air Force Base, and crews would have to fly between 6 and 8 hours at relatively low altitudes. And the way we talk about it, to give their radar the best look with the minimal clutter, and basically rotating on and off shift for 6 to 8 hours looking for these bombers. And over time, you can imagine that thinned out, but they were a critical element to feeding information into SAGE and basically covering those coastal gaps around our major population centers.
Yeah, and one of the challenges with the picket ships wasn't just cultural that the Navy didn't prioritize it, but it was also because it was challenging to integrate the information from the picket ships into SAGE because it wasn't a Navy program. And that was another value of the EC-121 was not only was there a cultural integration in prioritization, but it also made it easier to integrate their sensors as well. But the development of the EC-121 is huge. And I'm glad you mentioned, Bobby, that it was a convergence of both the aircraft, not only having the legs and the duration and having the right airframe, but also the right, basically what we would now call swap C, to be able to manage the size, weight, power, cooling, to be able to power the radars as those radars came down, became much more portable, which was huge because now suddenly we have very powerful radars, which are married up with real-time air battle managers in the aircraft, looking at the raw data, being able to process that, and then be able to do battle management from that. And we took that advantage of that in Vietnam because the EC-121 was a game changer in Vietnam and the beginnings of the modern-day air battle manager.
Yeah, so the Connie opened up a lot of different options that, as we started to get into the Vietnam conflict, that our war planners started to see. And at this point in time, it's also important to know that the first non-homeland defense mission that weapons controllers on the Connie were assigned to was actually Operation Blue Straw, which was clearing out atolls for nuclear tests. And that was where a lot of folks started to see, wow, we can move this thing. It can operate independently and it can feed information into a system that isn't directly tied to SAGE. We should start looking at this. And so the 552 Airborne Early Warning and Control Wing was actually tasked in 1965 to Formosa, now known as Taiwan, to fly sorties over Vietnam. And then that's where we really started to see, where fighter pilots in really thinking expeditionary applications started to see the value of this early warning and control. And so, they went out and they started the pairing up. And ultimately, I got a pretty interesting statistic that I found here, where through the course of Vietnam, the EC-121 and the controllers, they controlled over 4,713 sorties for a total of 48,000 combat hours while controlling 210,000 fighters against 700 MiGs. And so that advantage that they gave was massive. And they actually ended up moving the EC-121s in 1967 to Thailand, where they were actually based with the F-4 units that they were paired against. And this led to this integrated debrief that would happen, where controllers were actually starting to compare And this is where we actually saw control crews get credited with assisting with kills, where, up until that point, only pilots and Rios had been given the assist, but they started including the controllers on it because of the advantage that they gave them. And so it was a huge turning point. There was a lot of TTPs that were developed in this point in time. But unfortunately, when the Vietnam War started drawing to a close, some of these things, the value of it started to be questioned outside of Homeland Defense.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the integration of the EC-121 with the F-4 crews. Fun fact, in terms of being able to understand what information is important that a warfighter needs to listen to and pay attention to, when Robin Olds would be going through his mission preparation, he would reach out to the crew, the EC-121 crew that would manage him, and tell him what exactly he was looking for, and they would call him by name to be able to get his attention airborne and then vector him towards a threat. And that's one of the reasons why he was so successful.
Manage your money on your time with 24/7 digital banking on the PenFed mobile app. Easily make payments, transfer funds, and deposit checks through mobile deposit.
That's music to my ears.
Learn more at penfed.org. Federally insured by NCOA.
So, Slider, let's move to you and talk about being a fighter pilot, right? Talk us through what it would like to launch as a fighter pilot in Air Defense Command. I mean, I sat my share of alert, but it was different back in ADC time. Why was the processing of mass data to actionable information so crucial?
Yeah, I got to tell you, that's one mission set that I never got to fly here in the Homeland. Did a lot of stuff overseas, but it must have been so exciting to be a part of this entire enterprise of Air Defense Command. Those missions were super risky. You had pilots pushing the edge of the technological envelope. Doug mentioned it earlier, new aircraft, the 100 series, the Century series coming out. And so the pilots are learning new aircraft every few years.
And you got an orange flight suit to go with it.
Yeah, the orange flight suit.
That's right. And these pilots are pushing the airframe boundaries as well as the engine boundaries. And so very little room for error as they're maneuvering these aircraft. And then you throw on top of that the all-weather night challenge. Coming out of World War II, you did not have all-weather and night-capable pilots.
No.
And so the aircraft had to be designed to be able to fly instruments and have anti-icing and all the things that we're so used to and accustomed to these days. None of that stuff existed coming into the 1950s. So a lot of aircrew training was required. And then finally, the intercepts themselves. I can tell you as an F-16 pilot with a very advanced radar and locked onto a target at high altitude, running an intercept on that high altitude contact is extremely challenging. And that's with an afterburner, and that's with complete situational awareness of what that maneuvering target could be doing. These pilots are being vectored by a radar operator on the ground using communications that are lagging whatever's actually happening up there in the air. And the pilots are doing the best they can to try to follow these directions. And then they're trying to get visual contact at 10 to 15 miles.
Yeah.
But they don't know exactly where that bomber is heading. They can't tell exactly the nose position of that bomber at 10 to 15 miles. And it's like, I always tell my kids, like running an intercept, imagine driving two cars at 60 miles an hour head to head. And then you try to intercept that car and end up right behind that car, and you're on a 2-lane highway. It's impossible. You can't do it. You have to like square that corner and end up right behind that car at 60 miles an hour. You end up in what we call in the fighter world in lag, where the car is pulling away from you and you're just watching it leave you in the dust.
Yeah, because if you think about the engine capability, and I've flown some of these vintage jets. I mean, you push it up into maximum engine and you wait for 12 seconds for the thrust to kick in.
And that's if it doesn't cough.
Yeah, that's if it doesn't cough. So as you mentioned, like you have to take lateral offset and you have to be pulling on the sticks. So you're burning off energy as you're making that turn. You're climbing because they're high because they want to be high for
But you can't pull too hard because you'll bleed energy.
Exactly.
And then the bomber starts walking away from you. And there's nothing you can do about it.
And their missiles aren't going to make up the distance. So yeah, this was really
super challenging.
Yeah, super challenging. So Doug, at its peak in the 1960s, this defense enterprise, we've talked a lot about it, from the aircraft and the technologies to the information systems, from the air battle managers. I mean, like, this is huge. Why did we de-emphasize the value of Air Defense Command and Homeland Security?
I think it's a a bunch of different events that were conflating. First and foremost, the Vietnam War was putting a lot of budgetary pressure on the United States military. We saw Air Defense Command come off of manning surface-to-air missiles in 1972. The fact that so many of the offensive Soviet nuclear systems were going to missile technology, including ICBMs, which you're not going to intercept with an F-106 or an F-102 or anything like that.
You can't even see them.
Yeah. It saw our realistic ability to deal with that threat kind of go down. They still had bombers. I mean, we still had to deal with it. So it didn't totally go away, but it came down a lot when you saw Soviet transition to the missile technology. It was harder to pull an intercept on. The FAA ended up taking over a lot of the sites in the 70s that was SAGE and things like that. And then in 1979, Air Defense Command was effectively folded into Tactical Air Command. And so the mission still executed, folks are doing it, but I think we could say there was probably a dilution of excellence and just total drive in this, because it was a PhD level varsity sport in the 50s and 60s, but 70s, we just kind of come off a little bit. And I mean, Heather, your life story, you're a part of that. You lived kind of the low point of what Air Defense Command was on 9/11, where we had nothing and we had just given up on it. And the TTPs were so radically out of date, and just we hadn't even thought about it. We were just pulling off dusty Cold War playbooks in that morning, and which is wrong for what those conditions were. And we really just lost the art of imagination of what air defense would look like. And I think that's something that if you watch the news today, you cannot escape how absolutely important this stuff is right now, because we don't want to be Kyiv.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting how you were able to tie together the different events, whether or not that was the focus on the Vietnam War, whether or not that was the development of the intercontinental ballistic missile, and so how the ICBM fundamentally shifted the value proposition, if you will, of traditional air defense fighters and the radar systems that we had built, and including moving even over doctrinally the surface-to-air missiles over to the Army, how all of that came together, and then the organizational element of that going over to TAC, de-emphasizing the importance of this. But, the ICBM, that's a really interesting point, because although the problem set becomes very complicated and poses dilemmas to us, it wasn't a reason to de-emphasize the importance of being able to defend against that. So Slider, Reagan sought to address that threat during his tenure through Star Wars.
Yeah, right, Lucky. So Reagan, he was very clear, not a fan of the mutually assured destruction or the MAD strategy. So in 1983, he announced his intention. He wanted to build a missile defense system, and this was going to defend the United States from ballistic nuclear missiles.
Yeah.
He called it SDI, or Strategic Defense Initiative. Some called it Star Wars program, as it had a very elaborate space component. But he was very clear. His desire was to make nuclear ballistic missiles obsolete. And so this met all sorts of response. Some folks thought it was super. Other folks thought this might destabilize things with us and the USSR. But the vision was solid. Build a space-based system, a network that could sense, track, and engage ballistic missiles fired from the USSR and engage them before they threatened the United States. So lots of important programs were started. They had advanced sensor programs, visible light, ultraviolet, infrared, radar energy, all tested to track missiles using space-based sensors. And you have to remember, computers were just becoming mainstream. I think at the time I owned an Apple II Plus, something like that. And so huge challenges when it comes to computing and assembling all this information across the arrays of sensors that were being proposed. In the end, ultimately, the technology just wasn't there, especially in the directed energy department, and not for lack of trying. They pursued laser, directed energy, X-ray lasers, particle beams, all kinds of things that you would imagine. Even mirrors in space demonstrated the ability to redirect directed energy from the surface of the Earth. So a lot of proposals out there. But unfortunately, it was a solid vision, clear guidance, The technology just wasn't there at the time to bring it to reality.
Yeah, being too far ahead. But we were able to reap some of those, like SIPR's a space-based infrared system is some of that, right?
Yep, spinoff.
Yeah, it's a spin-off. So we're able to mature some of those technologies, but not in the system in the way that SDI was originally envisioned. So then the end of the Cold War happens. So we actually don't need to pursue the full vision of SDI. We sunset that. And also nearly all the other elements of the air defense enterprise. So all of those alert units, gone, right? And so we had next to nothing in the years after the Cold War. And even after 9/11, really, it doesn't even begin to approximate what we had at ADC. So we're still really thin. Why is now a back to the future moment?
Yeah, so Lucky, I'd say we're still definitely thin. But most importantly, I think we've got to highlight how much the threats changed. We're now in a multipolar world. You got China, Russia, host of other countries that threaten our homeland, not just nuclear weapons, but as we've seen in Ukraine, you've got the precise conventional cruise missiles, one-way drones, hypersonic missiles. All of these types of missiles hold American military and civilian infrastructure at risk. And we don't have the means to detect, let alone intercept these threats. So I think the Golden Dome proposal is going to bring a lot of these issues to light. And then I think some important resourcing decisions are going to have to be made. So similar to back in the 1950s, we can't defend everything all the time. A conversation is going to happen, and we're going to have to determine what's truly vital for national security and what's less so.
And not only is it that it's multipolar, but I think after the end of the Cold War, we kind of thought, we're back to moats, Atlantic Ocean, Pacific Ocean. There's really, in addition to becoming complacent regarding the threats, after the end of the Cold War, we relied on our oceans again and the fact that we had friendly nations to the north and to the south. And so it's not just that it's multipolar, that we have actual adversaries now, but it's also the technologies. And as you mentioned, those technologies are incredibly lethal, but they can reach out and they can touch us. So
yeah, I just want to jump in though. There's a piece here where it is back to the future. We came off air defense command concepts like we talked about largely because of the high-end missiles, ICBMs, things like that. But look what's going on in the world right now. If you look at what Iran is doing against Israel, I mentioned Kyiv with what Russia's doing, you see things like cruise missiles and you see drones, which are effectively another form of cruise missile. And that is bringing back airborne threats in ways in which we haven't had to think about since the 50s. I mean, you're kind of back to those B-29 speeds and altitudes again. And there's another point that's really important, and that's called threshold of escalation. If China or Russia are to fire an ICBM against the United States, they're going to trigger an immediate response, and you're going to see nuclear war. Nobody, hopefully, wants that. But if they send over a couple dozen or a couple hundred cruise missiles at us, we're going to start up conflict and all. But does it escalate to nuclear exchange right away? I mean, there might actually be incentives for them to pursue lower ends of an offensive power because it'll still net important results. By that, I mean holding back forces in the homeland for the defense mission, which means we have less power to project abroad, whether it be Taiwan Strait scenario or defending a region in Europe with NATO or something like that. And so I think in many ways, it brings back a lot of the core elements that we saw with the ADC model being more relevant than ever. So this is, at Mitchell, it's why we're a big fan of the E7, why we fought hard for it this summer, because I think those radars can be more important than ever. It's why, Houston's talked about RPAs have a lot to offer because they can do that persistence mission up there. We've got to modernize the over the horizon radars. And so Golden Dome, they're big on space. I think applaud that. I think there's a lot there, but this is an air and space mission. And I think there are a lot of lessons that we can't forget because we're in a zone where those might be the more useful tools for the Russians and Chinese to pursue.
I think that's a really important point, the threshold of escalation and the fact that it's going to be air-breathing threats and that fighters and all the traditional elements of Air Defense Command actually provide enhanced response capability against those types of threats than what we're typically thinking of in Golden Dome, which is really thought about as like a ballistic missile shield. So, Bobby, swinging back to you, talk about those macro elements of the Cold War enterprise that Doug just brought up that are especially relevant today.
Yeah, so technology is always changing, in these macro elements, and each side is striving to build a better mousetrap, but the fundamentals really still stay the same. We need effective detecting, We need technology assisted fixing and tracking, and we need weapons to effectively engage and assess. And if there was one thing that Homeland Defense really hammers home, and Doug alluded to this too, is it's the need for the technology that acts as a force magnifier, making better use of the costly advanced weapons that we're investing in now. And this theory has been proven. It's been proven over and over again in the Battle of Britain, the Gulf War, and other conflicts that, the good news is that these investments in Homeland Defense are readily applicable to various other conflicts and various other challenges that we may face in the national security arena. So the elements are very much the same. You have a threat. You have people that are, in this gray zone, potentially looking to do something or leverage an effect to get a reaction from us. And our ability to credibly deter that is a huge part of our ability to maintain like our hold on the American way and American power.
No, and I would also say that the E-7 and MQ-9s, because they are airborne, they're flexible. They can move around to the battle space to where we think those threats are going to be coming from. Unlike a lot of radars, which are going to be fixed sites, they're going to be networked through the ground. There's a lot of surface attack area, and being a fixed site presents a huge liability. So those E-7s and MQ-9s, I think, are going to be a crucial element. So we have to have those in number. So, Doug, what's different about the threat this time? You already alluded that it's more to a back to the future moment. You talked about the threshold of escalation and how cruise missiles and drones and those types of capabilities might be more attractive to an adversary.
What's different is it's way more complex. Before, we just focused on the Soviet Union. Now you've got Russia, you've got China, you've got North Korea, you've got Iran, and you have their proxies. And there is an arrogance with which they are currently acting right now that I think people were sobered coming out of World War II. Nations had just gone through hell in ways in which we can't even get our heads around. We read about it, but I don't think you can understand it really unless you're there. We now see nations like China and Russia and the others throwing down in very aggressive, risky ways. And there's a perception that America is not going to throw down and respond, and it might not even have the means to respond. We go back to how we got out of Afghanistan and how damaging that was. We look at the vacillations with Ukraine and are we going to defend it or not, and weapons flows and all. It is leading to tremendous strategic ambiguity about where does America stand, which I think leads to an even more aggressive adversary because they think they might get a shot at getting away with something right now. And let's face it, our budgets are not corresponding to where the threat is. I mean, you want to know a difference, look at the resources allocated to Stand Up Air Defense Command and NORAD in the 50s versus where we are today. And that's why in Houston's paper, we are big fans of repurposing things that we already have, like Global Hawks, like MQ-9s, like expanding how E-7 engages. There are things that we're already doing in space with Space Development Agency and things like that. How can we repurpose these tools to better net the effect? Because realistically, the cash just is not following fast enough, but the threat is out of sight in some levels, even more dangerous than what we experienced in the Cold War. Certainly larger, but they're cooperating. And like I said, I think there's a level of arrogance where it's kind of the teenager. They think they can throw down and get away with anything. And there's that hubris. And that's a very dangerous time. And we need to reset that fast.
Well, and I would foot stomp what you said about them cooperating. I don't think that China and Russia and Iran and North Korea are just cooperating. I think they're really developing, if you watch their actions, a new axis. I mean, they are creating partnerships that are both formalized as well as informal that really create problems for us from a global strategic perspective. And I would argue it's not just about strategic ambiguity, but our waffling and the way that we have behaved over the last 15 to 20 years is actually an erosion of our strategic commitment to our allies, partners, and to our own homeland defense. And that's going to embolden them even more. So Slider and Big Bobby, what is different today about our means to respond? I mean, Doug talked about how much money and resources was put into Air Defense Command. SAGE was on the magnitude of the Manhattan Project. People don't realize really how far they pushed the boundaries of what was technologically capable, both networks, processing, sensors, and how they built the whole thing. I mean, right now, we've got to rebuild the Air Force writ large, And now we have to think about Homeland Defense as well.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start off here, Lucky. There's going to be some similarities to what we did back in the past. And so there's going to be a layered approach, but we've got to get an upgraded layered approach. And as I mentioned earlier, our sensing grid needs major investment. On the surface, it's over-the-horizon radars. In the air, we need the E-7 Wedgetail we talked about. More than ever, we need to couple those with the medium to high-altitude UAVs. You've got MQ-9s, RQ-4s. This is what these things were built for: long endurance, low threat environments. And something that not a lot of people are talking about are these new passive sensor technologies that give these long loiter aircraft tremendous value in the early warning mission. We've got to get these sensors fielded and out there so we can get these unmanned systems out on the front lines. And then space sensing capabilities, they're already noteworthy. Lots of missile launch capability in space. AMTI has been talked about for so long. Space radar needs continued investment. Unknown how long this capability is going to be before it really reveals itself. It's nascent. It may be in 5 years. It may be longer. No one really knows. Now, on the fighter side, the Air Force continues to, as we all say, divest to invest. And so we're divesting all these fighter aircraft. But hold on to the fourth generation fighters. Don't divest them, because they can play a very important role here. Upgraded aircraft radars are going to give them tremendous capability in cruise missile intercepts. And over in the Middle East, we've seen Strike Eagles carry the APKWS. These are the air-to-air laser-guided rockets that can intercept at a very low cost per kill against non-maneuvering targets. Tremendous capability.
So, Big Bobby, Slider talked a lot about some of the technologies that we need, but we need to have the humans too. I mean, big battle manager fan. What else do you think we need to do to be able to respond to this threat?
Yeah, so he mentioned Slider mentioned the sensor web. It's growing, and it still has gaps. And one of the gaps that it has too is just in the data management of all the information, the data that comes into the system, and that's where humans play a big role. And I'll get to that, the human part, when we get to the key points at the end. But it's also not just about the tech, but the skills. We need to integrate the networks onto survivable platforms and facilities. And I'd also like to take a second here to break down what survivability means. We talk a lot about that now. We need to get more survivable platforms. We need it, but space is survivable in many ways because it's often physically out of reach, but it's vulnerable in other ways with its networks. And it's the same with aircraft. Aircraft are considered to be less survivable in the geographic battle space, but in many ways more survivable from a network perspective because it has closer access to the effects. And so this is something that we really need to think through as we invest in our different weapon systems is, hey, what does survivability mean? Where do we need it to plug gaps? Where do we need it to be a force multiplier? And really we need layers and elements of all of these things to be effective.
Yeah, so let's go around the table. What key considerations should leaders have as they harness historical lessons to inform our air and missile defense response today? So we're going to go around the table. Slider, let's start with you.
Okay. Standing up Air Defense Command, huge lift. You had early radar technologies, you had new fighter aircraft, you had an armada of Soviet nuclear bombers that could strike at any time. The experts agreed that if this massive attack were to occur, they'd be lucky to intercept 20 to 30% of these threats. I'm not certain that the public knew how low that number was, but the point is that someone decided back then, what's the minimal level of defense that's acceptable? And define that. And then everyone was in agreement that would limit damage, assure the public that we're here to defend you, and provide early warning to begin a response as soon as possible. That same mindset needs to be applied today and to have those benefits of whatever this next system is going to be for our national defense.
Oh, that's a really good point. I mean, and a lot of folks don't realize that, for example, in Israel, as they're defending against the incoming cruise missiles and drones and ballistic missiles, that when they determined where the impact point would be, they said, do we need to actually go intercept that? And they let a lot of stuff hit the ground where it was going to cause minimal damage so that they could prioritize defending against population centers, key critical infrastructure, and so forth. So that's a really crucial point. Big Bobby, what do you got?
Yeah, so I think variety and options are key, and they're key for Homeland Defense. They're key for our combatant commanders, And we need all the advantages that ground-based, fixed, and mobile sites offer, as well as the air and spaceborne platforms that are out there. The different things that we invest in, we can't just look through a single lens. Like an investment in a homeland defense system is also a semi-lateral investment into our expeditionary capabilities. And so it's not just mutually exclusive. But the other major thing that we really need to invest in is the skills and our operators and the people that make this mission happen. Technology is great. And, as Doug and I talked about early on, the find, fix, the kill chain, there is many, many, many places that technology is going to aid in that. But at the end of the day, war is a human endeavor. Conflict is a human endeavor, and investing in our people and the skills that they have to make better decisions, to be a better force magnifier, to better utilize these exquisite technologies that we have and we need to make the decision to let something hit the ground, to program that thing into the AI or the decision based on the conflict and the nature that we're in. That's huge. And, right now, on the battle management side, we've lost 2/3 of our platforms with the retirement of the E3 and the E8, and our ground-based systems were just kind of getting to the point of maturing. And so where do we mature these operators? Where do we mature that team? Where do we mature the fighter pilots, the controllers, the technology to be a credible deterrent in the Homeland Defense mission and a viable expeditionary option?
I'm glad you really brought that up. And the other part that worries me about retiring the airborne early warning and battle management is not simply that we're losing the warfighters, and that is true, right? We're losing the experience, the knowledge, the wisdom to grow the next generation. But also we're losing the flexibility of where we put those humans in the system, right? Those ground-based operation centers are not going to be necessarily as nearly as flexible as forward edge of the battle space or as mobile as we might need them. Doug, I'm going to give you the last word, but before I pass it off, I'm going to share what my consideration would be is that when we took Homeland Defense seriously, we stood up Air Defense Command because we understood that we could not project power and play the away game and be an expeditionary force and still do Homeland Defense with the robustness that we needed to be able to do. So we created a dedicated command to be able to do that. And today's alert units do both, right? They have to sit alert and they have to go deploy to be the away game. And what that means is that not only are we burning them out fast, we're burning the jets out, we're burning out the people, but if we have to do a Homeland holdback to defend the homeland in time of war, we will not have the capacity, the warfighters, the aircraft, the weapons to be able to go play the away game. So we really need to think about if we are serious about defending the homeland, what does that need to mean for our force structure? So Doug, you got the last word here.
No, and just to continue your thread, Heather, just before we get off that point of capacity being so important, extend us to space as well. We need sufficient numbers of Guardians to man the necessary consoles. We need the constellations proliferated to give the right coverage on, the northern axes and things like that. And so that build out of capacity has got to extend to space. That is vitally important because we have to do it all. And if one of our key vulnerabilities is we'll just get the United States to initiate a homeland holdback, that gives the adversaries free rein in areas where we really cannot afford to pull punches. But the last point that I think brings us all together is political will. You're hearing about this more because President Trump decided to make Golden Dome a thing. My fear is that the second he is gone at the end of his tenure, this is either going to get written off as a Trump thing or they're just going to move on, whatever, new person's priority. And when we think about Homeland Defense in the Cold War, it extended across parties, it extended across administrations. It was fundamentally a national imperative. Go back to the line I said earlier. We can't afford to be Kyiv. But unless we get real about this and run a marathon, not just a sprint, and then decide to go have amnesia in 3 years, it's not going to work. And so we need to really play a long game here. And that means getting real about Congress's commitment, DOD's writ large commitment. And right now, it's still too much of a pickup game. You go to the Hill, you talk to the offices and all. Yeah, they all kind of get it. It's important. Yeah, sure, whatever. The president wants it. But I'm not seeing a visceral ownership that, no kidding, this matters and we've got to rise to the occasion. And we saw it before in history. We need to see it again. And maybe it's that generation had lived through World War II. They saw what it was like to come up to the brink of possibly losing and losing in the biggest terms possible. And we cannot risk those cards again. I mean, we need to be smarter and play a deterrent game. And I think air defense and space defense and all of the homeland is a key part of that.
Okay, Doug. So you just begged the question. This cannot be just a flash in the pan. We have to remain committed to this. So if we're going to do that, where should we be in 5 to 10 years?
For me, it's that we've scaled capacity both on air and space. We have the training pipelines, and we have the appropriate allied relationships, because these warning nets have got to begin further away than where we had them before, just because of the speeds involved.
Big Bobby, how are you going to grade our homework?
I mean, in 5 to 10 years, and we invested in, like I said, the force magnifiers that are out there that really make the technology we've created more lethal. And we invested in the people skills that have matured these things and figured out where exactly they need to go. We're not fighting wars of mass as much anymore. I don't think we want to go to those days. And so I think that the smarter we approach our investments in the technology and the people and the platforms, the better off we'll be. And in 5 to 10 years, I'll let you know.
Yeah. Well, we might not want to fight wars of mass, but mass is a way for adversaries to complicate our problem set, especially if we're catching them in the homeland defense. So, Slider, what kind of, how would you grade it?
Heather, you're letting him off the hook here. 10 years, he'll be a general officer. Be General Bobby. He'll be his fault.
General Big Bobby, and it'll be his problem. It'll be his fault.
I'll be subject to my own homework.
Yeah. All right, Slider, what do you got?
I want to reemphasize Doug's last point when it came to, does this survive the next administration?
Yeah.
Are we still talking about this homeland defense and the criticality of it because the threats continue to get more advanced, more precise, more persistent? We have to take homeland defense seriously, and it's got to become a multi-generational thing. And
I would totally agree with you, and follow the money. If the money's there and it's actually building out the capacity, maturing the technology, programs of record that are actually being procured, we have to buy them, not just R&D them. That's, I think, going to make a big difference. And then follow that up with an organization that I think, I would almost argue, do we need to reconsider ADC? Gentlemen, thank you so much. It's been great to have you here to talk about, frankly, what is an existential issue for us as a nation.
Thanks, Lucky. Important conversation.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Big Bobby.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah. Thanks, Doug. All right. And with that, I'd like to extend a big thank you to our guests for joining in today's conversation. I'd also like to extend a big thank you to you, our listeners, for your continued support and for tuning into today's show. If you like what you heard today, don't forget to hit that like button or follow or subscribe to the Aerospace Advantage. You can also leave a comment to let us know what you think about our show or areas that you would like us to explore further. As always, you can join in on the conversation by following the Mitchell Institute on X, Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn, and you can always find us at mitchellaerospacepower.org. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great Aerospace Power kind of day. See you next time.
Okay, I just want to add an item for the record, Heather. I didn't want to interject this in the prime conversation, but let's get real about the picket ship. You think about bobbing around the sea, staring at a radar scope. They're puking their guts out. That's how they had to get rid of those ships. It was torture.
Actually, that is 1,000% true, because in the research that I did for that net assessment paper, they talked about how miserable those picket ships were. Because they were just anchored there, just bobbing around.
Yeah, I did in my research for my paper. It was incredible, like the fight between the Navy and the Air Force over like who does that mission or not. And the Navy really, they wanted a part of it because of the budget that was there, but they didn't really want to do that mission. And they were fairly happy to get the C-121, and we shared that platform with the Navy for many years.
Well, I think there's a program that may be just as difficult. Did you guys come across the Ground Observer Corps?
Oh,
yeah.
Dude,
yeah.
305,000 volunteers that were willing to go stand in the middle of Montana and look for low altitude aircraft ingressing the homeland.
Well, you know what? So this is exactly what they did during the doubting system with Britain during the Battle of Britain. So you had the chain home radar that was looking out, but there was this dead zone. Once they started passed over the coast, because chain home wasn't looking in, what would happen would be the chain home radar operators would pass that information via telephone back to the control center, which would then literally telephones. You'd have observers out there with a little portable telephone and a wire and like a little headset.
Yeah.
And they would get phone calls. And so they would actually get past the aircraft tracks and they would be searching with their binoculars and call in the incoming.
How many there were.
How many there were, the incoming aircraft, where the direction they were going. That would help validate the controllers that were doing all the filtering and plotting and things like that. It was, that was amazing. But it's interesting because when ADC was developed and they had those ground observers, the Ground Observer Corps, that think of all the other voluntary things that we were doing for Homeland Defense, because all of our soldiers had gone out and saw how completely not just decimated, devastated that Europe was. And so it wasn't just that we knew suddenly now we were in a strategic competition, but they saw the first person consequences.
And that just doesn't exist now.
No. All righty, boys. Thank you so much. It's been great. Big Bobby, give baby Bobby our love. Is he gone?
He's gone dark.
Yeah, he's gone dark. he's dark and he's muted, which means baby Bobby might actually be in the room, in the house.
That's too funny.
All righty, gentlemen. Thanks. We'll see you
Safe
later.
travels, Doug.
Well,
See ya.
see ya.
He just disappeared. Wonder where he went.